Most people assume death comes without warning, that one ordinary day becomes your last and you don't even realize it while you're living. But throughout history, there have been people that somehow knew something was wrong before they died. Some had recurring nightmares. Some suddenly became scared for reasons they couldn't explain. And some even told family and friends that they wouldn't be alive much longer. And in a few cases, that reality came true just a few hours later. And whether these stories are coincidence, subconscious awareness, or something even stranger, I'll let you decide. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Spooky Files. If you're returning, thank you so much for coming back. And if you're new here, we're so glad to have you. I'm your host, Mary Ellen Quigley. This is where we dive into the paranormal, the unexplained, the I swear I saw something, but I don't want to admit it moments that we all have and now have a place to talk about them. Today's episode is a little different because we're not talking ghosts and paranormal, and we're not using listener-submitted emails or messages. This time, we're diving into the historical accounts that happened in real life from people who predicted their death before they died. All of these are creepy, and all of these are true. So, grab a cup of coffee, get comfortable, and let's get into it. We're starting first with one of the most famous death premonitions in American history, and that is Abraham Lincoln. Just days before his assassination in April of 1865, Abraham Lincoln reportedly described a terrifying dream to several close friends and members of his cabinet. According to accounts later documented by Lincoln's friend and bodyguard, Ward Hill Layman, Lincoln described wandering through the White House late at night. Everything was strange and silent except for the sound of crying somewhere inside the building. And as he moved from room to room, he eventually entered the East Room, where he found a covered corpse surrounded by mourners. Lincoln reportedly asked, "Who is dead in the White House?" And someone answered, "The president. He was killed by an assassin." Only a few days later, on April 14th, 1865, Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. During the performance, he was shot by John Wilkes Booth. He died the following morning. What makes this story especially eerie is that multiple people later confirmed hearing Lincoln discuss strange dreams and feelings in the days before his death. Now, some historians still debate on how accurate these retellings are, but the dream itself became one of the most famous alleged premonitions in American history. Reference points for this story include Ward Hill Layman's memoirs, White House historical archives, newspaper retellings published after Lincoln's assassination. And honestly, the worst part about this story isn't the dream itself, because people dream about death all the time. But dreaming about a murdered president inside the White House and then being assassinated days later, that's the part that becomes hard to explain away entirely. But Lincoln wouldn't be the only person who seemed strangely aware that death was approaching, because decades later, one of the most famous disasters in human history would leave behind its own disturbing story of premonition. Story number 2 is about the Titanic. Even more than a century later, the sinking of the RMS Titanic remains one of the most haunting disasters in history. And if you grew up in my generation, especially so because Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet made us feel even more emotional about this event. More than 1,500 people died after the Titanic struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic on April 14, 1912. But what many people don't realize is how many strange stories emerged afterwards involving passengers who reportedly had bad feelings before boarding the ship. One of the most famous examples involved businessman George Dunton Widener. According to accounts from family members, Widener reportedly felt uneasy before the voyage and almost canceled the trip entirely. Other passengers allegedly told loved ones they had recurring nightmares involving dark water, crowds, and panic before boarding. One woman reportedly refused to board after repeated feelings of dread. And then there's perhaps the strangest detail of all. Years before the Titanic disaster, author Morgan Robertson published a novella called Futility, or The Wreck of the Titan. The fictional ship in the story is described as enormous, considered unsinkable, lacking enough lifeboats, and sinking after striking an iceberg in the North Atlantic. The similarities became so disturbing after the Titanic sank that many people believed Robertson had somehow predicted the disaster. Now, realistically, many people believe some of these passenger stories were exaggerated afterward by grief and hindsight. And that's probably true in at least some of the cases. But what makes stories like this fascinating is that after the tragedy happens, people start replaying every strange feeling, every canceled trip, every conversation they had about it, trying to figure out if the warning signs were there all along. So, reference points, if you want to check this out yourself, is several of the historical Titanic passenger accounts actually talk about this. Of course, Morgan Robertson's 1898 novella, Futility, and also the Smithsonian and Library of Congress Titanic archives also have several firsthand accounts where people talk about this experience. And maybe that's why the Titanic's stories still affect so many people today, because the disaster already feels frozen in time. And the idea that some people sensed it beforehand makes it even more haunting. Our next story is a little bit different because this wasn't a private dream or warning that was shared with family members. Millions of people eventually heard the words for themselves, and knowing what happened afterward, the words sound almost impossible to listen to now. And that is Martin Luther King Jr. On April 3rd, 1968, civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. delivered a speech in Memphis, Tennessee. Today, it is simply known as the mountaintop speech. And listening to it now is chilling because throughout the speech, King repeatedly references death. At one point, he said, "We've got some difficult days ahead." And later, "I may not get there with you." The following day, on April 4th of 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated outside the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. And what makes this story different for some of the others is that it wasn't a secondhand account. This speech was recorded and it's replayed almost every year on Martin Luther King Day. Millions of people have heard it. And hearing someone speak so openly about death less than 24 hours before they're killed is very unsettling. Now, reference points for this would be, of course, the archived recordings of the mountaintop speech, the Civil Rights Museum historical records, FBI historical timelines, and also news coverage from April of 1968, which you can find all over the internet. I think what makes this one so emotional for people is that King didn't sound afraid. I think he probably knew that there were threats against his life, and he sounds like, if you listen to the speech, like he was mentally and emotionally prepared for that outcome. And while the speech is beautiful, it's also very haunting in hindsight. And a couple shorter stories that I found interesting as I was doing my research for this episode. Mark Twain. So author Mark Twain was born in 1835 during the appearance of Halley's Comet. And throughout his life, Twain would joke and sometimes even seriously claimed that his life was connected to it. And in 1909, he reportedly told his friends, "I came in with Halley's Comet in 1835. It's coming again next year, and I expect to go out with it." Halley's Comet returned in April of 1910, and Mark Twain died one day later. Now, unlike some of the other stories we heard, in this episode. This one feels a little less horrifying and more poetic, which I guess kind of goes with the fact that it was Mark Twain. But it leaves people wondering, was this simply an old man making a dramatic prediction, or did Twain genuinely feel like his life was nearing an end? And if you want to check out the story yourself, you can look at Twain's autobiographical writings where he mentions it. The New York Times reporting after his death, there's an article online you can find. And also, there are several historical records tied to the return of Halley's Comet in 1910, where Mark Twain's death is referenced a few times. And then our last one is one that hits a little close to home because my mom and dad were huge fans of Buddy Holly, but Buddy Holly is our last story of the day. By early 1959, rock musician Buddy Holly was exhausted. The Winter Dance Party tour had become miserable. Freezing buses, broken heaters, long overnight drives, musicians getting sick. So after a show in Clear Lake, Iowa on February 2nd, 1959, Buddy Holly decided to charter a small plane. That decision would become one of the most infamous moments in music history and become known as the day the music died. But before the crash, there were reportedly unsettling warning signs. According to interviews and accounts from those close to Holly, his wife, Maria Elena, later claimed she had an intense feeling of dread before the trip. Other musicians on the tour also described growing unease surrounding the weather and travel conditions, and perhaps most famously, Richie Valens reportedly lost a coin toss for one of the plane seats, a random moment that sealed his fate. The plane crashed shortly after takeoff in snowy conditions, and everyone on board was killed. So what makes this story so dramatic is, of course, the strange moments beforehand, right? The feelings of dread, the decisions that were made last minute that ended up changing the fate of the people on board. And afterwards, people genuinely began asking, did they somehow know beforehand? And if you want to look out reference points, there's several different articles and books written about it, tour interviews from surviving musicians, and then the FAA reports and historical coverage of the crash are actually available online if you want to read more into it. So why do stories like this affect us so deeply? I think it's because they challenge the idea that death arrives unexpectedly. Is it coincidence? Is it your subconscious? Is it just pattern recognition? Or something we don't fully understand? Because throughout history, people have reported strange dreams, feelings of dread, sudden certainty, and warnings they couldn't fully explain shortly before tragedy struck. And maybe there is a logical explanation for all of it. Maybe the human brain notices the dangers long before we consciously understand it. Or maybe every once in a while, people really do sense when the end is near. And honestly, I don't know which one I find more creepy. And that brings us to the end of this episode of The Spooky Files. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. Follow me on social media. Leave a comment because I love hearing from all of you. If you have a story you would like me to share on the podcast, you can send it to thespookyfilespodcast@gmail.com or fill out the Contact Us form on thespookyfilespodcast.com. I read every single email or message, and it helps us build a community of people that don't just love the paranormal, but want a safe place to talk about all of the things we don't always admit out loud. Make sure to follow or subscribe so that you don't miss the next episode. If you're looking for more paranormal content, check out my other podcast, Hoosier Myths and Legends, where my sister and I talk about all things spooky from the state of Indiana. Season 7 starts on May 30th. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and keep it spooky, my friends.